Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we are checking out Nvidia's new GeForce RTX 3060 Ti. This is their new $400 GPU designed to replace the RTX 2060 Super. Now, unfortunately, I don't have the Founders Edition model on hand for testing as Nvidia didn't send that out, but we do have 4 pretty cool AIB models to use, so that's kind of nice. The models on hand for testing include the EVGA For the Win 3 Ultra. So this is a fairly sort of compact. It's kind of long, but it is a dual slot card, but yeah, pretty compact, I would say. Anyway, cool little graphics card, that one. Then we have the Gigabyte Gaming OC Pro. So the Gaming OC version now has a Pro added to the end, so just more things to say. So that's great to see. And then we have the MSI Gaming X Trio. Pretty familiar with this thing now. This looks very similar to the 3070 version, quite a large graphics card, so expect that to perform well. And speaking of large graphics cards, then we have the Asus ROG Strix version, which is by far the heaviest of these 4. And again, very similar to the 3070 version. So a nice big RTX 3060 there. Anyway, of these 4 cards, I didn't test all 4 of them through our 18 games because that would be suicide. I used the first card that arrived, which was the Gigabyte Gaming OC Pro. So this card has been used to represent the RTX 3060 Ti, but towards the end of the video, we will take a look at out-of-the-box performance for all 4 of these models, because again, I just didn't have time to test all of them with their dual BIOSes and all that kind of stuff, but we'll have a look at how they perform out of the box in terms of thermals, clock speeds, and all of that sort of stuff towards the end of the video. The RTX 2060 Super is the current $400 GPU from Nvidia, and the 3060 Ti should be a substantial upgrade as it packs just 17% fewer cores than the RTX 3070. The memory subsystem though, that remains the same, though we saw the same configuration with the 2060 Super as well. So 8GB of GDDR6 memory clocked at 7000 MHz for a 14 gigabits per second transfer speed, and with a 256-bit wide memory bus that results in a peak bandwidth of 448 GB per second. I should note that the cores are clocked slightly lower, 3.5% lower in fact than those of the RTX 3070, so that sees them boost to 1665 MHz. As a result, the 3060 Ti has a board power rating of 200 watts, which is a 14% increase from the 2060 Super. Given what we've seen so far from Ampere, I'm expecting the 3060 Ti to be a good bit faster than the 2060 Super, though the real test I feel will be how it fares against the outgoing Radeon RX 5700 XT. After all, the 5700 XT is the previous generation $400 champ, and it was over 20% faster than the 2060 Super on average. So I'm very keen to see if the 3060 Ti can finally put down AMD's first crack at their RDNA architecture. For testing, I'm still using the Ryzen 9 3950X test system, but I will be updating to the 5950X as soon as I can. Updating all of this data will take a solid 2 to 3 weeks of testing, so it's not going to happen overnight, but it is something that I'll work on as soon as we get through all of these new products. Having said all that, the 3950X has little influence on the 1440p data, and it doesn't limit the 4K results at all. So for the most part, very little will change when moving to the 5950X. Speaking of resolutions, I'm going to focus on our 1440p data since this really isn't a 4K graphics card. I've also dropped the 1080p data as scaling is very similar across both 1440p and 1080p. That said, I will provide the 18 game average data for 1080p and 4K, while I'll also include it in our cost per frame analysis. One last important detail, since I wasn't able to get the Nvidia GeForce RTX 3060 Ti Founders Edition graphics card, I've had to test with one of my AIB samples, and again, I used the Gigabyte Gaming OC Pro as it arrived first. Now, this card does come with a 6% factory overclock, so it will perform a bit better than cards following the reference or base spec, so please be aware of that. That said, I'm using the MSI Gaming X version of the 2060 Super, which is also a factory OC card, while the 5700 XT is represented by PowerColor's Red Devil, another factory OC card. When I update the data soon with the 5950X, I will replace the Founders Edition results for the 3070, 3080 and 3090 with factory OC AIB models, and I'll also do the same with my 6800 and 6800 XT results. Unfortunately, at the time of making those reviews, I was only able to test with the Reference or Founders Edition models, so my hands were kind of tied there. Truth be told though, it doesn't really make a huge difference. A 6% overclock will typically only net you around a 3 to 4% performance boost on average. But anyway, keep that in mind as we go over the results. Speaking of which, I think it's about time we poured over those blue bar graphs. First up, we have Godfall, and as expected, the 3060 Ti isn't a great deal slower than the 3070, trailing it by just a 13% margin with 62 FPS on average. That meant it was 19% faster than the 5700 XT, so a reasonable performance uplift there. Of course, the massive 48% uplift over the 2060 Super is far more impressive, but given that wasn't a terribly relevant previous generation product in our opinion, it's hard to get excited about an almost 50% boost there. Whereas Godfall's a new AMD sponsored title, Watch Dogs Legion is a new Nvidia sponsored title, and unsurprisingly the 3060 Ti does even better here relative to the 5700 XT, beating the previous generation Radeon GPU by a 30% margin. It was also 42% faster than the 2060 Super, and again just 13% slower than the 3070. Having settled at just 61 FPS on average at 1440p isn't exactly amazing performance, and we're also yet to enable ray tracing, though we will look at that soon, along with DLSS performance in this title. The RTX 3060 Ti performs very well in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, trailing the 3070 by just a 9% margin, though again we're only looking at 58 FPS on average, which admittedly is enough for this style of game, though I personally would tune the quality settings for reduced input latency. When compared to the 2060 Super, we're looking at an almost 30% performance boost, so that is nice, though the 3060 Ti was only able to match the 5700 XT in this new AMD sponsored title. So it would seem as though Nvidia has some driver optimization work to do. Dirt 5 is yet another new AMD sponsored title, and again we find a situation where the 3060 Ti is slightly slower than the old 5700 XT, despite beating the 2060 Super by a 30% margin. It'll actually be quite interesting to see how the 5700 XT and 2060/2070 Super stack up by this time next year. We certainly seem to already be seeing a situation where the RDNA architecture is aging much better than Turing. Even in Death Stranding, the new RTX 3060 Ti isn't a great deal faster than the 5700 XT, beating it by just a 13% margin. That's despite trailing the 3070 by just a 9% margin. We're also talking about a massive 40% performance uplift over the 2060 Super. So again, while the 3060 Ti looks fantastic compared to Nvidia's previous $400 US offering, it is less impressive when compared to AMD's. Where we do see a rather healthy 25% performance boost for the 3060 Ti over the 5700 XT is in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020, taking the average frame rate at 1440p up to 40 FPS on average. That again meant it was just 9% slower than the 3070 and almost 30% faster than the 2060 Super. Even in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, the 3060 Ti was just 9% slower than the RTX 3070 with 108 FPS on average. It was also much faster than the 5700 XT, beating it by an almost 30% margin, and a massive 46% margin over the 2060 Super, making Tomb Raider one of the best showings yet for the new RTX 3060 Ti. It also remained strong in Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Siege, beating the 5700 XT by a convincing 24% margin and burying the 2060 Super by an incredible 56% margin. It was also just 12% slower than the RTX 3070, so overall a great result and not that far from the 2080 Ti, a part that once fetched over $1,000 US. F1 2020 has been a strong title for AMD in the past, and here we're seeing that the 3060 Ti is only able to beat the 5700 XT by a mere 7% margin, though we are seeing 2080 Superlight performance from the 5700 XT. So, like I said, this is a strong title for AMD. Still, despite the disappointing margin over the 5700 XT, the 3060 Ti was 51% faster than the 2060 Super, so that's a monstrous generational improvement for Nvidia at the $400 US price point. Here we're again seeing that the RTX 3060 Ti delivered RTX 2080 Superlight performance with 82 FPS on average at 1440p in Gears 5, making it just 9% slower than the 3070. That said, it was also just 11% faster than the 5700 XT, despite beating the 2060 Super by an almost 40% margin. The Horizon Zero Dawn results are very surprising, as here the 3060 Ti was just 4% slower than the 3070, delivering 92 FPS on average, allowing it to beat even the RTX 2080 Ti. When compared to the 5700 XT, we're looking at a 31% performance increase, so very impressive here, and a truly massive 61% increase over the 2060 Super. We're looking at a very decent 21% performance gain over the 5700 XT in World War Z. That's of course quite a big leap, but it's not a massive performance uplift at the same price point. But what is massive is the 61% performance jump we see from the 2060 Super to the 3060 Ti. When compared to the 3070, the 3060 Ti was just 11% slower, so again, not much separating these two Ampere products. Metro Exodus is one of the few games that is quite heavily CPU limited with the Ryzen 9 3950X at 1440p, and as a result, the 3060 Ti is just 4% slower than the 3070. Despite that, the 3060 Ti doesn't appear all that CPU limited, given that it was still 27% faster than the 5700 XT and almost 40% faster than the 2060 Super. Testing with Resident Evil 3 reveals the 3060 Ti to be just 10% slower than the 3070, and this is fairly typical of what we've seen so far. Even more impressive is the fact that in this title it was 23% faster than the 5700 XT and 51% faster than the 2060 Super, so that's a really nice upgrade at the $400 price point. The RTX 3060 Ti again managed to edge out the 2080 Super, this time in Doom Eternal, and that meant it was 99% faster than the RTX 2060 Super. That's pretty crazy stuff. That said, it was less impressive relative to the 5700 XT, though still impressive, as it was 42% faster, and that's obviously quite a substantial margin. So basically, the 3060 Ti is a beast in Doom. The RTX 3060 Ti also dominated the previous generation cards in Wolfenstein Youngblood, beating the 5700 XT by a 42% margin and the 2060 Super by a 56% margin. It was also just 11% slower than 3070 and 2080 Ti. In the last game tested, the 3060 Ti was also just 10% slower than the RTX 3070 in Hitman 2 and 27% faster than the 5700 XT, so an excellent result here. We're also looking at a 42% performance uplift over the 2060 Super, so again, when compared to Nvidia's previous generation $400 US part, the 3060 Ti looks amazing. Now here's a look at the average performance seen across the 18 games tested. Although we didn't spend time looking at the 1080p data in this review, I did collect it, and those graphs will be made available to Patreon and Floatplane members. To save time, here's a look at the 1080p average data, and as you can see, at this lower resolution, the RTX 3060 Ti was on average just 8% slower than the RTX 3070, though be aware, at times the 3070 will have been limited by the CPU. Still, for those gaming at 1080p with a CPU equal to or slower than a Ryzen 9 3950X, the 3060 Ti won't be much slower than the RTX 3070, though it also won't be much faster than the older Radeon RX 5700 XT. Here we see just a 15% performance uplift on average. Even so, when compared to the 2060 Super, we are looking at a rather massive 41% performance improvement, so that is quite impressive. Now, 1440p were almost never CPU limited, with the exception of 2 to 3 titles. Even so, this time the 3060 Ti was just 9% slower on average when compared to the RTX 3070, so a very similar margin to what we saw at 1080p. That said, it does extend its lead over the 5700 XT out to 21%, which is a decent performance uplift, but not a super impressive leap for a next-gen GPU. Rather, the super impressive leap is seen when looking at the RTX 2060 Super, as the 3060 Ti was on average 50% faster at 1440p, and that is a serious generational improvement. It's just a bit of a shame that the margin over the real previous gen $400 champ wasn't bigger. Now at 4K, the 3060 Ti is seen trailing the 3070 by just 12%, which again is a surprisingly small margin. It's also now 28% faster than the 5700 XT, which is a decent margin, though in my opinion neither are really suitable for 4K gaming. The cutoff there I'd say is either the 2080 Ti or 3070, and even the 3070 might be questionable moving forward with its limited 8GB VRAM buffer. Okay, time for a look at the cost per frame, and for this one I'm going to stick with the MSRP data, at least for the 1080p results. I'll make some adjustments to the 1440p results, which we'll look at in a moment. So, in a perfect world where the MSRP meant something for all models, the 3060 Ti would be coming in well below anything we've previously seen in terms of cost per frame. But let's move on to the 1440p results to continue this discussion. Okay, so again, we'll start with the MSRP comparison before looking at retail prices. When compared to the RTX 3070, the 3060 Ti should be coming in offering 13% more value per frame, and 14% when compared to the RX 6800. Now, when compared to the outgoing models like the 2060 Super and 5700 XT, the 3060 Ti is 18% more affordable per frame when compared to the 5700 XT, and 33% more when compared to the 2060 Super. Given the performance just seen, and the fact that they should all cost $400 US, really no surprises here. But what about the actual retail prices? Well, let's start with US pricing over on Newegg.com. Now, be aware, almost all of these graphics cards are out of stock, and while the Ampere GPUs have seen numerous resupplies, they sell out instantly. What we're looking at here is the cheapest list priced of each AIB model. There are 3 3070 AIB cards at the MSRP and 3 3080 cards at the MSRP. There's also a single 6800 that's just below MSRP. It's the Power Color Fighter, and there's another at the MSRP. The 6800 XT, though, doesn't have any AIB models at or near the MSRP, the cheapest being the Sapphire Nitro Plus at $770 US. Finally, there's a few 5700 XTs at $400 US, but the vanilla 5700s are all overpriced, presumably due to a lack of supply now. So, taking those listings, this is what you end up with. Basically, the 3060 Ti is still great value, with the RX 6800 also looking very good, albeit at a much higher price point. The RTX 3070 also looks good, though it is coming in at a 14% premium per frame when compared to the 3060 Ti. It's really only the 6800 XT that looks a bit weak here, though it's not too bad compared to the RTX 3080, at least for those wanting to game at 1440p. Now, if we jump over to the Australian market, we find that the margins really aren't that dissimilar to what we see over in the US at Newegg, and some retailers are very competitive with the 5700 XT, though the 3060 Ti is still expected to come in around 5% better value per frame if it can hit the MSRP. The RX 6800 is also very competitively priced, and again, it's really just the 6800 XT that's out of position. For those of you in different regions who are working with different prices, all you have to do is get the price for each model you wish to compare, and then divide that price by the average frame rate shown here, and that'll give you the cost per frame. As for ray tracing and DLSS performance, we're just going to have a look at the 1080p and 1440p performance, and I'll be comparing the RTX 3060 Ti with the 2060 Super and RX 6800, which is currently the cheapest Radeon GPU that supports ray tracing, though obviously it's not a direct competitor for the 3060 Ti. As seen previously, the 3060 Ti is 34% faster than the 2060 Super and Watch Dogs Legion at 1080p, and with ray tracing enabled, that margin doesn't change by much. Using ultra quality ray tracing, the 3060 Ti is 38% faster and then 41% faster using medium quality ray tracing. We're then looking at a 36 to 42% margin when using ray tracing in conjunction with DLSS, and then just a 26% margin with both cards using just DLSS. So again, while Nvidia has optimized the 2nd gen RT cores and the 3rd gen Tensor cores, there's no real improvement in actual performance at the end of the day, given there's just less of them. So an efficiency improvement for sure, but an actual performance improvement relative to the standard rasterization performance, not so much. Basically, the 3060 Ti will offer similar ray tracing performance to that of the 2080 Super, which is good, I suppose, for $400 US, but how useful that is at this performance tier will depend on your standards. Personally, gaming at 60 FPS feels pretty sluggish for me. Even games like Watch Dogs, I like to play at around 90 FPS. The input just feels a hell of a lot better, and I favour input over visual quality, at least when it means playing at or below 90 FPS. Of course, everyone is different, so if you're happy with gaming at, let's say, 60 FPS, then the 3060 Ti will deliver a good experience at 1080p with DLSS enabled. That said, I also find the visual upgrade from 1080p to 1440p to be massive, certainly bigger than the kind of upgrade you get from going from 1440p to 4K, which is probably one of the reasons why gamers aren't rushing to 4K. Anyway, if you want to play at 1440p, you'll have to be okay with less than 60 FPS with DLSS enabled, and you can expect regular dips down into the low 40s. And the game is unplayable using just ray tracing in my opinion without DLSS enabled. Again, my personal preferences would see me disable ray tracing entirely in Watch Dogs Legion with an RTX 3060 Ti, and instead go with quality DLSS for 77 FPS on average, which saw frame rates consistently above 60 FPS. For this title and likely many others that support DLSS 2.0, the RTX 3060 Ti can deliver a better gaming experience than even the Radeon RX 6800, so that is very impressive. Now, again, because I don't have the base spec Founders Edition model, the power figures are going to be a bit all over the place, and therefore I've tested all 4 AIB models. As you can see, the Asus ROG Strix model used the least amount of power, but even so, total system consumption was increased by a few watts when compared to the RTX 3070 Founders Edition. The 3060 Ti FE model should use around 20 watts less power, making these AIB models a lot less efficient, though that is fairly typical. Using Nvidia's PCAT to look specifically at board power, we again see that the Asus ROG Strix model uses the same power as the RTX 3070 Founders Edition at 226 watts, which is about 20 watts over the base spec. The MSI Gaming X Trio is way more power hungry though, hitting 255 watts, which is well over spec, presumably MSI is being more aggressive with their stock voltage. Now, for the performance per watt, I'm using the Gigabyte Gaming OC Pro data, as that's the model I use for testing. I'm also using the 1440p data. Previously, I have focused on the 4K data, which is much more favorable to higher end Ampere GPUs, which do scale better at the high resolution. At 1440p, we're seeing just how inefficient the RTX 3080 and 3090 are in terms of performance, and as a result, performance per watt isn't nearly as impressive as what we've seen previously at 4K. That said, the 3070, which does scale more consistently, does fare very well, losing only to the RX 6800. The Gigabyte RTX 3060 Ti Gaming OC Pro, though, uses the same amount of power as the RTX 3070 Founders Edition, and therefore doesn't score as well here, though the performance per watt is still quite good. Had I been able to use the FE model, I imagine the 3060 Ti would be comparable to the 3070. Okay, so let's talk about thermal performance, fan speeds, and operating clock speeds. Starting with the Gigabyte Gaming OC Pro, it peaked at just 67 degrees, which is a fairly low temperature, though the fan speed was very high at 2100 RPM. That said, there is a silent bias, but due to the extreme time constraints, I've only been able to test each of these 4 AIB models using the primary or default BIOS. So 67 degrees with a 2100 RPM fan speed, and it maintained a clock speed of 1950 MHz after 30 minutes of gameplay. And by the way, all of this testing was conducted in the Corsair Obsidian 500D with a 21 degree ambient temperature. Next up, we have the Asus ROG Strix, which peaked at just 58 degrees. That's a 9 degree improvement on the Gigabyte model, though you can expect the Strix card to fetch a much higher price. Anyway, 58 degrees with a 1600 RPM fan speed, so an excellent result, and again we saw a clock speed of 1950 MHz. The EVGA for the Win 3 Ultra peaked at 72 degrees with a 2000 RPM fan speed, so that is the worst result we've seen so far, and although the clock speed was 1.5% higher at 1980 MHz, that's really a negligible difference. Last up, we have the MSI Gaming X Trio, which is another premium RTX 3060 Ti, and this model peaked at just 61 degrees with an 1800 RPM fan speed, though like the EVGA version, it maintained a core clock speed of 1980 MHz. Based on this very quick look, I'd say the best model here is the Asus ROG Strix, though it's also likely to cost the most, and then I'd say the second best card was the MSI Gaming X Trio. Now, just lastly, here's a look at overclocking with the Asus ROG Strix RTX 3060 Ti. Given how cool this model ran, I decided to use it for overclocking. It managed a stable 2.1 GHz for the cores, while the memory achieved 16 gigabits per second, and this resulted in a further 9% performance, which placed it on par with the stock spec RTX 3070. So not bad, though fairly typical for these new Ampere GPUs. Okay, so when compared to Nvidia's previous $400 offering, the RTX 2060 Super, the RTX 3060 Ti is a mighty impressive upgrade, offering 50% more performance at the same price point. So yeah, as I said, pretty impressive stuff that, but of course, as I've mentioned more than once already, the 2060 Super wasn't exactly a great value previous gen product. And really, in this price range, the go-to option for many was the Radeon RX 5700 XT. It certainly was for us. We highly recommended that card. Excellent value there. And in that comparison, the RTX 3060 Ti is offering about 20% more performance. The 5700 XT was released about a year and a half ago, so a 20% boost in that time frame, it's certainly not bad, it's just not earth-shattering either. Had the 3060 Ti offered more VRAM, it'd be a bit more exciting and perhaps more enticing for those of you already rocking a 5700 series GPU. The 3060 Ti really is a great upgrade option though for those with something like a GTX 1070. So those who decided to skip Turing, the ray tracing hype generation that offered little to nothing in the way of a cost per frame improvement. For those with a GTX 1070, you're looking at a 90% performance uplift on average at 1440p, while GTX 1080 owners are looking at a solid 60% performance uplift. You're also getting ray tracing support, something those older Pascal GPUs didn't offer, though I've got to say for me personally, I find ray tracing to be a bit of a pointless feature of the RTX 3060 Ti, and my reasons go beyond the usual lack of game support. So let's talk a bit about that, and please be aware that What I'm about to say is based on my own personal preferences. So this is my opinion, my personal preferences. They may or may not align with yours. So I guess take what I'm about to say with a grain of salt, because if you don't have the same expectations as me, then this won't mean much to you. But trying to explain where I'm coming from. So for me, I'm really not down to play at 1080p, and that's not to insult anybody who does play at 1080p. I'm looking at this from the perspective of someone spending $400 US on their graphics card. So for me, when I'm investing $400 US, which is a large sum of money, on a graphics card, I'm really not interested in playing at 1080p. Maybe if I was a professional gamer or something like that, then I'd be investing a lot of money to play at 1080p, but yeah, not the case. Personally, I believe 1440p offers a significant visual upgrade, and because of this, I haven't used a 1080p display in over a decade now. In fact, it was 2008 when I purchased my first 2560 by 1600 monitor, and I had that for about a decade, so pretty good investment there. It was an expensive monitor, but 10 years is also a long time. So, that being the case, 1080p ray tracing performance just isn't where it's at for me. These cards need to deliver at 1440p, and a sub 60 FPS experience when leveraging DLSS is again not something that I'm particularly interested in. So for me, the RTX 3060 Ti technically doesn't support ray tracing, as it can't deliver an acceptable level of gaming performance with it enabled, even with the help of DLSS. However, what is a very neat feature, and I would absolutely use, is DLSS. Going from 61 FPS in Watch Dogs Legion to 77 FPS with no noticeable downgrade to the visuals is a big deal. It's also a feature that I'd use in more competitive games, such as Fortnite, for example, which now also supports DLSS. Fortnite actually also supports ray tracing, but it is a complete waste here in my opinion, even with an RTX 3090, as any half-decent gamer will be turning down most effects or turning them off entirely, again for a competitive advantage, and that's exactly what I do. Now, for those of you wondering why we didn't enable DLSS for the benchmarks just seen in the games that support it, like say Death Stranding for example, in short, we prefer to show native performance as it's an apples to apples comparison. DLSS, while super impressive, it isn't always flawless, sometimes suffering from artifacts where it fails to properly fill in the missing information. Additionally, AMD's also said they have their own DLSS type technology on the way and hope to have it supported by a much broader range of games. So that could drastically change this discussion in the near future, but of course we'll just have to wait and see on that one. No matter which way you slice it though, right now the GeForce RTX 3060 Ti is the best value $400 US option on the market, and there's simply no way you'd invest in a Radeon RX 5700 XT beyond this point. Of course, if availability is anything like what we've seen with the 3070, 3080 and 3090, buying a 3060 Ti is going to be extremely difficult. And based on what I'm hearing, availability will be similar to that of the RTX 3070, so much better than the 3080 and 3090, but obviously it will sell out right away, and you might struggle to snatch one up over the next few weeks. Unfortunately though, none of the models I checked out today will be available at the $400 US MSRP. The EVGA RTX 3060 Ti for the Win 3 Ultra is expected to cost $450 US, while the MSI RTX 3060 Ti Gaming X Trio will start at $470, and I expect that we'll see a similar price for the Gigabyte model as well. Asus didn't give pricing in time for this review, but you can rest assured that the ROG Strix model will cost at least $500, and at that point you might as well start looking at RTX 3070s. Anyway, that is going to do it for this review, this first look at the RTX 3060 Ti. I hope you guys enjoyed this review. I will admit it was very rushed. I sort of ran out of time on this one. Wanted to cover a lot of stuff, and yeah, time crept up on me. I didn't manage my time too well on this one, so yeah, threw this one together quite quickly, so hopefully it didn't appear that way. But anyway, we will have more content probably around the 3060 Ti coming up on the channel soon. I guess it depends on what availability looks like for these and how much demand there is from you guys. So if you're interested in that though, subscribe because it may happen. Of course, like the video if you liked it. And if you would like to support the channel more directly, get involved with the Hardware Unboxed community, then you can do so over at Patreon or Floatplane. We have a Discord chat where no matter which one of those things you sign up for, you will have access to the same Discord chat as everyone else. We have a core community there. It's very cool. Tim and myself are active there as well. We do a monthly live stream where you can obviously watch that live and interact with Tim and myself live, ask us questions and that sort of stuff, and the rest of the Hardware community. So that's pretty cool. Q&As, behind the scenes videos. Anyway, if you're interested, all that stuff is in the links or can be accessed via the links in the video description. Oh, it's been a long couple of days, guys. So yeah, thanks for watching. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.